Hi. In the next video, I will discuss carbohydrate digestion and absorption. We first need to remember what dietary carbohydrates require any digestion in the first place before they can be absorbed. And those include starch, a polymer of glucose, and the three disaccharides, sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Now let's start in the mouth. Now we know that we produce saliva, and saliva contains an enzyme called amylase. And amylase is able to break down starch to some degree. Because as soon as you swallow the food and it enters the stomach, the salivary amylase is quickly inactivated by the acidity of the stomach, and no further digestion is taking place. And digestion doesn't restart again until the food reaches the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, where the pancreatic juice is added to the food. Now, the pancreatic juice contains an enzyme called pancreatic amylase, and that's also a starch-degrading enzyme. And through its action, starch, the polymer of glucose, is broken down into much smaller units, ultimately maltose, the disaccharide of two glucose subunits. So we end up with maltose, sucrose, and lactose as the disaccharides that need further digestion before they can be absorbed. And the body has the appropriate enzymes to be able to break down those three disaccharides to the monosaccharides. So we have an enzyme called lactase to break down lactose. We have an enzyme called sucrase to break down sucrose. And we have an enzyme called maltase to break down maltose. So at the end, we end up with the three monosaccharides: glucose predominantly, galactose, and fructose. So let's follow those three monosaccharides. As I pointed out, they're produced in the small intestine, and they need to be absorbed into the bloodstream. And this happens after uptake by the intestinal cells, or so-called enterocytes. So the part of the enterocytes that borders the interior of the small intestine has special transporters that allows the cells to take up these monosaccharides. Now, on the other side of the cell, there is the bloodstream. So there is another set of transporters to transport the monosaccharides from the interior of the cell to the bloodstream. And what is important to realize is that once they enter the bloodstream, the monosaccharides immediately go through the portal vein to the liver. So they're not distributed across the body. They first go to the liver, so the liver can decide on what happens to these monosaccharides. And actually, that means that for fructose, most of the fructose is actually cleared, or almost all of it is cleared, so no fructose reaches the tissues outside the liver. Whereas for glucose, actually, a substantial amount of glucose continue to go to the rest of the body. Okay, now that's the situation for the digestible carbohydrate. Now what about some of the non-digestible carbohydrate, or dietary fiber? Now the definition of dietary fiber is that it is not subject to digestion to our normal digestive enzymes. And that separates it from the digestible carbohydrate that we just discussed. Now that doesn't mean that there's no digestion at all, because depending on the type of fiber, there can be some digestion taking place in the large intestine, or colon. And that happens through the microbiota, the bacteria that reside in the colon. And we call this fermentation. Now, depending on the type of bacteria present, you get different products of fermentation. But an important class of products are the so-called short-chain fatty acids, but as we can obviously recognize, as many of us have experienced when we eat too much fiber at a single meal, there's other gases produced, and that gives rise to flatulence, or gas production. Now let's zoom in a little bit more on these microbiota, and specifically on some of these products. So we talked about short-chain fatty acids. They include acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And they're believed to be at least partially responsible for the beneficial effects of fiber. So fiber reaches the colon, is fermented, produces these short-chain fatty acids, and these short-chain fatty acids are absorbed in the cells locally, but also may travel further away for instance, reaching the liver and have positive effects elsewhere. On top of that, we produce other gases, methane being one of them, hydrogen sulfide being a very foul-smelling one, and there's other gases that we produce. Now, nowadays, there is a lot of interest in the role of dietary fiber, and especially in the role of the gut microbiota, because we are increasingly realizing that a lot of the beneficial effects of dietary foods, of dietary nutrients, may be mediated through changes in the gut microbiota. And there's a lot of research activity going on trying to figure out how the microbiota is changing in response to certain dietary changes, and also what the impact of the changes in the microbiota may be on human health. And for many diseases, we're finding links, and hopefully in the next few years, we'll get a lot more insight into the importance of the gut microbiota. So in short, what I've told you is how dietary carbohydrates are digested, that essentially we require a number of enzymes, mainly amylases and various disaccharidases, that break down the starch and the disaccharides into monosaccharides. That the non-digestible carbohydrates or dietary fiber ends up in the colon, where it is subject to digestion or fermentation by the bacteria that reside there, and that can give rise to various products, including short-chain fatty acids.